It didn't end with shouting. There was no final argument, no grand walkout, not one slammed door or explosive confession. Instead, something much more quiet and much more permanent happened. The Brown family did not go down with a bang, but instead unraveled slowly, almost politely, as if all concerned knew that to cause a commotion was to merely prolong the inevitable. The explosion that was expected to blow people away never materialized, as there was simply not enough fuel to keep it burning. This is one kind of ending that is most commonly misunderstood. It can look calm and even civilized to outsiders, but to the insiders, it's the accumulation of unresolved conflict, unresolved needs, and epiphanies for years. Not enough to create a scene, but enough to make it impossible to stay. The Brown family had long been under the impression that strength and endurance were the same things. So long as they stuck with things, things would eventually even out. This kept the family hanging on for far longer than they should have been. Rather than fixing problems, they merely delayed them. Rather than a solution coming from a conversation, a temporary fix would be made. And temporary peace always proved safer than honesty. Every case of avoided conflict felt like progress. Every case of lessened feelings was seen as maturity. Every case of bitten-back disappointment was seen as loyalty. And eventually, the family had become proficient in surviving without actually having to heal. That's how endings without explosions are created. It is not one mistake in 1,000, but 1,000 mistakes in one. That is, not one betrayal in 1,000, but 1,000 betrayals in one that will. To start with, everything was subtle. There was a conversation that didn't quite go anywhere. Then there was a promise that was made in earnest but never came to pass. There was a gesture of effort that came at the wrong time, in a way that made a difference only in hindsight, and in a way that wasn't quite enough to leave, but in a way that made it dangerous. This is because when nothing seems big enough to leave, people stay even after the relationship is no longer beneficial to them. The family learned to operate in dysfunction rather than fixing it. Needs were redescribed to be more manageable. The expectations were scaled back without drawing attention. Hope was raised to meet reality. And with all adjustments, all dysfunction became perfectly normal. Here is where the explosion is concealed. Those who suffer pain on a regular basis cease to respond to it. They cease to resist it. They cease to refer to it as pain even. They develop a life that is accustomed to being disappointed because they no longer believe that relief is forthcoming. That's what occurred in this case. Before anyone actually walked away, they were already gone emotionally. The talks were already over. The effort was already no longer coming in an equal flow. There was only logistics left and not love. And since the emotional labor had already been accomplished, there was nothing left to explode. Perhaps the most confusing element about quiet endings is the amount of clarity they contain. A common misconception about a quiet ending is that if a dramatic confrontation had not taken place, a clear motive could not possibly exist. This is typically a misconception. Clarity doesn't have to scream. Sometimes it speaks for years. Strictly speaking, it whispered whenever an effort was not returned, every time the needs are acknowledged but not met, and every time hope is put off just a little bit longer. Finally, the whisper becomes impossible to ignore. That's about when people stop trying to be understood and start trying to be at peace. In the Brown household, peace began to mean a lot more than being right, more than being listened to, more than being heard by someone who had shown that they weren't listening in the way that counted. Thus, instead of fighting harder, people retreated. They stopped explaining, stopped convincing, stopped waiting. That's when the inevitability of the ending becomes apparent, long before it manifests. There was no explosion because there was nothing left to defend. There was no shared future to disagree upon. There was no conviction that one more chat could alter the course of events. The denouement was almost tranquil because the decision had already been reached. Remaining was no longer less painful than leaving, and having realized that, it doesn't take any form of drama to proceed. It just needs permission. This is how families fall apart without the bang of fireworks. It's not because they didn't love enough to fight, but because they loved enough to know when it's time to stop fighting. And that was only the start. Once that inner decision has been made, everything alters. Not a thing to the outside eye. People come, they respond to the messages, they smile when necessary. The emotional bargain, however, has already shifted. This is where a stranger is most likely to get confused. They don't see fights, they don't hear ultimatums, they fail to watch dramatic splitting. What they see, rather, is distance that is difficult to measure. This happened in the Brown family, too. The space did not loudly proclaim its existence. It seeped in tentatively, camouflaged as growth and patience. Everybody told themselves they chose calm over chaos and cooperation over conflict. They did. Responsibility without reciprocity is a burden. People stop demanding change at this point, not because they don't want change, but because they lose hope that it is possible. Asking for a change is no longer necessary. The discussions are just redundant. The same cycle repeats with a variation in words, but a never-changing emotional payoff. So people adapt. They don't share anymore what's been hurting. They stop expecting comfort. They stop fantasizing about a future that needs collaboration. They instead start planning an absence. Here is where the ending actually starts, well before anybody leaves. For the Brown family, this stage had gone on for years, long enough for imbalance to feel normal, long enough for selective efforts to occur, long enough for some voices to be softer while others led the way in decision-making. This isn't working anymore did not need to be stated. Everyone already knew. The difficulty with this stage has to do with the self-editing that has to happen. People will find themselves picking and choosing the things that they feel the need to talk about versus the things that they'd rather not mention. Then, after a while, the censoring becomes natural. Thoughts will stifle themselves before they ever get verbalized. And the cost of self-editing is identity. You lose not only the relationship, you lose parts of yourself which could never be given permission to exist in this relationship. This is particularly true in societies that prefer harmony over authenticity. Ease is what's rewarded, with difficult being a punishment. People come to understand that peace in this state is not unconditional, that it's strongly predicated on silence. The Brown family was really good at that kind of peace. However, a silence-based peace isn't actually a state of peace at all. It's an avoidance with a calm face. But as this avoidance escalated, the family relations began to change subtly. The balance of power began to shift towards the center. Emotional labor became uneven, and the responsibility of maintaining the stability began to rest on the same shoulders again and again. Those shoulders eventually tired. When individuals reach this point in their life, they do not usually proclaim it to the world. They do not give any warnings or ultimatums. They merely stop carrying what was never meant to be theirs in the first place. They disengage, not in anger, not in rebellion, but in self-preservation. This disengagement is often mistaken for apathy for the outside world, but there is clarity within the disengagement. Clarity that exists within the realization of acceptance, that one is not being met and probably will not be met. As the acceptance becomes the reality, the emotional hold begins to loosen. The longing to be understood dissipates. The impulse to fix things goes away. In its place comes a calm emphasis on self-stewardship. It becomes a question of when to go, not if, as it's often put. The explosion is never going to go off because there is no fuel left to explode it. The emotions that could have driven it to explode, like hope, anger, or longing, have all been internalized. This is because the ending becomes clear by the time it is noticeable. But that does not make it painless. It makes it final. Because non-explosive endings just do not lead to terms. They do not restart dialogue. They do not stay in what if. They shut the door gently, thoroughly. And then once that door is closed, it will never reopen again. Not out of stubbornness, but out of understanding. The family wasn't avoiding conflict anymore. They had already moved beyond it.
At this point, the emotional shift had occurred on a structural level. What had been temporary emotional responses had solidified into fixed patterns. Silence was no longer a cessation of speech, and distance was no longer a period of time. It quoted him. Still, nothing exploded. This is because explosion needs pressure with no escape. But pressure in the Brown family had an escape route before the point of explosion came into consideration. People let off the pressure with no noise, by letting the expectation decrease and redirecting their energies elsewhere. This is the stage when the relationship stops stinging every day. They become numb. Numbness is confused with peace, yet it's easier to handle than the pain of disappointment, because numbness already means that the investment into the emotion has been diminished. One is no longer present because it costs too much to be present. The family continued, though it was functioning on inertia. Roles were fulfilled out of habit and not connection. Things were done because they had always been done, and not because there was some meaning in them at this point in time. Thus, when tradition substitutes intention, a hollowing out of the system commences. What made this so hard was the fact that the imbalance wasn't drastic. It didn't appear to be cruelty. It just looked like the absence of care tempered by loving motives. Promises were kept, the occasional display of affection was there, but it was unpredictable, enough to keep one holding on to hope, not enough to repair the trust that was lost. That inconsistency is exhausting, he continued. Individuals begin questioning themselves. Is it really this bad? Do I ask for too much? Is this simply the way families are? It is this self-doubt that keeps an individual stuck for so much longer than any degree of anger. Within the Brown family, that uncertainty lingered for a number of years. Every individual convinced themselves of selecting adulthood, selecting patience, selecting the bigger picture, but the bigger picture kept getting smaller and smaller. The future they were building just never seemed to be getting closer, and nobody could explain exactly why. What they could feel was the weight of carrying relationships that no longer carried them back. At this stage, the emotional disengagement becomes invisible even to the people who are undergoing it. They actually never tried to care less about people, they just stopped responding. The issues that once broke their hearts are now just mere reactions to them. The conversations they had to have seem redundant. Sometimes that emotional silence is the precursors to leave. Because when people cease reacting, that means they have ceased hoping. And if things come to the point that there's nothing remaining to hope for, then there's nothing more to negotiate. The change in the family dynamics had been gradual, that none of them could remember a time when things went otherwise. However, it was clear that the system no longer needed their complete participation. They were living in pieces instead of wholes. And the pieces will break apart eventually. This is why the ending came as a shock to some people and was long overdue for others. The family had been living with the damage for years. The damage had been done when the rest of the public saw the cracks in the family for the first time. There was no need for an explosion. The ending had already happened internally. Now it was a matter of navigating logistics to separate lives which had emotionally long been separated. It was a calmer process, of course, because the hardest work was accomplished in coming to terms with reality. This is the quiet truth about endings without explosions. They aren't kinder, they aren't easier, they are simply resolved, and resolution does not argue, it does not plead, it does not ask for closure from another, it accepts that which is and moves on. This is where the family found themselves, not in conflict, but in conclusion. But once a finding is made, there is no return to the question. After finding resolution, relief would not follow, at least not directly. After all, when folks stop fighting to hold on to a relationship, they don't feel liberated, they feel a loss of direction because their life had organized itself, had constructed a framework, a matrix, that no longer needed work because it simply didn't matter anymore. This level is calm, with intense weight. Others start to realize the elements of themselves that existed in the fold of the relationship, the choices that were made to not rock the boat, the ways in which they lessen their own desires to keep the peace. Remove the need to keep the peace, and it creates an opportunity, and it creates an unsettling feeling before it creates a peaceful feeling. For the Brown family, this reset occurred behind closed doors. There was not a collective awakening. There was not a common recognition that had taken place. Everyone dealt with the end in their own way and in their own time. This individual processing is also a reason why there was no explosion. Usually, in the aftermath of an explosion, there are people who still believe there is something worth saving, when they are still being heard, when they believe the other side may finally be able to understand if they can just be given one more chance to be heard. However, in this case, such faith had diminished. Instead, brothers and sisters turned, as ever, inward. They set about reframing concepts of stability within a structure other than that which had existed all along: independence, rhythm, and a remove that enabled a functioning without constant disappointment. It is at this stage that the guilt tends to arise. So-called quiet endings, on the other hand, do not feel as right as the dramatic type of endings do. There is no villain to speak of, nothing you can actually point at and say, this is where things came to an end. Was I patient enough? Did I give it enough time? Could I have tried harder? Questions like those are more profound and subdued conclusions than in explosive ones. However, such questions are also a part of the healing. They cause one to introspect, not only on what happened, but on what one was ready to go through. For the Brown family, the value of endurance had been ingrained for so long that to stop seemed like a failure. It was selfish to let go. It was abandonment to choose peace. Unlearning these stories took a while. And, of course, unlearning is seldom exciting. It's slow. It's uncomfortable. It's deeply personal. And with every individual embracing this, the dynamics of the family continue to unravel, not because of conflict, but by absence. Shared experiences were fewer and farther between, and the conversations they had were less substantial. The binding ties of emotions had already disintegrated. All that was left were remembrance, duty, and habit, nothing more. This is where the end becomes clear to everyone else. But by then, the news is stale information for the people living the experience. I know what's going to happen to them. They're grieving on their own, squaring themselves away with new realities of the relationship that don't involve them together anymore. And so when the community sees this process of calm separation, they could find it confusing. Where's the anger? Where's the heartbreak? Where's the drama? It has occurred. It just didn't happen on camera. However, the one big bang everyone waits for will typically be an internal one, and it will long before the last farewell. This will be when they realize they are shouldering too heavy a burden, when they realize love shouldn't mean waving their own identity away, when they finally grasp it's been more costly to stay than it ever could be to leave. As soon as that awareness sinks in, the only course is the inevitable, noiseless ending. Because at this stage, there is not a single person left who is aiming to win. They just want to survive.
After resolution came not relief, at least not immediate relief. After resolution came recalibration. When you stop fighting a relationship, you don't feel free. You feel disoriented. You had organized your whole life around sustaining something that didn't need to be sustained because it was gone. This phase is quiet, but it is heavy. They start to notice the amount of themselves that has been contained within the relationship, the amount of choices that have been made to avoid conflict, the amount of times they have settled their own needs in order to keep things balanced. There is a relief once the need to keep things balanced is lost. There is space, and there is space
before there is peace. The Brown family underwent this shift in a private manner. There was no collective realization of what had passed. There was no shared recognition of what had been lost in the relationship. That individual processing is one of the factors that also resulted in there not being an explosion. Explosions usually occur when people still believe there's something to save, when they are still trying to be heard, when they still think the other person might finally understand them if they just explain one more time. However, that idea had weakened here. Instead of turning to each other, they turned within. They started to redefine stability within and outside of the framework they had always known. They found it in independence, in new normalcies, in emotional detachment to enable themselves to function rather than constantly disappoint. Guilt shows up at this stage, so these quiet endings do not feel right. They do not feel as finished. There is no clear villain, no experience which you can look back upon and say, at this time it ended. This is the completion of a life. Was I patient enough? Whether I have given it sufficient time? Could I have done more to ensure that ant? These are the same questions that linger longer in the quiet conclusions of things, rather than the loud ones. But these questions are also essential parts of the healing that takes place. Because these questions make people reflect not only on where things went wrong, but on what they were willing to endure. In the Brown family, lasting had long been celebrated to the point where not lasting seemed like failing, releasing seemed so selfish, peace was seen as leaving, and unlearning seldom involves drama. Moreover, from it's slow, it's uncomfortable, it's a very personal. With each member going further along in this journey, the dynamic in the family was further unraveled. Not through fighting, no, through absence, through less shared moments, through less conversation. The glue that held it all in place was already long gone. What was left were memories, duties, and practices, but not connection. This is where the ending becomes visible to other people. They start to pick up on it, but by this point it's already old news to those living it. They've been grieving in secret, adjusting expectations, rebuilding their own notion of identity independent of said relationship. So when we find this calmly separating, it can be confusing to watch. Where's the anger? Where's the sadness? Where's the drama? It already happened. It just never happened on camera. The one that always blows up, always expects to go off, is always the internal one, years before a final farewell. This is when one recognizes they have been carrying too heavy a burden, not when one recognizes that love should not require sacrificing oneself, not when one finally grasps that staying is going to burn a hole in their pockets, a whole lot more than staying would have. Once the realization dawns that you are indeed alone, the end is inevitable and surprisingly quiet. Because at this stage, there is no one attempting to win anymore. They're just trying to live. Then, instead of all the emotions that probably should have accompanied this realization, happiness, relief, something strange happened. Calm. Nothing to look forward to, nothing to worry about, and no conversations to play out in one's head that would never happen anyway. This is a peace often confused with indifference. It isn't because the world stopped caring. It's because the world stopped bleeding. In the Brown family, this was the stage when everything seemed normal. This was the stage when the needs of the members had been met regardless. However, everything was normal even if the orientations inside the family had changed. Decisions were being made independently. This was the stage when people had stopped considering their emotional weather. This is when the balance of power silently shifts. As the individual becomes independent in their need for validation, the control exerted over the emotional atmosphere reaches the end of its reign. Far from being drastic, the effect is invisible. The power inherent in the control becomes less effective when the motivation for compliance isn't related to emotional needs. This transformation did not happen through a fight. An explanation wasn't needed either. It occurred because individuals regained control in their inner world. The family always used to revolve around one things: moods, expectations, and reactions. But as soon as they stopped revolved around one thing, space began to open up and clarity ensued. They saw how much of their own energies they had devoted to taking care of someone else's comfort, how many times they changed their own ways to avoid creating friction, how many decisions were couched in the form of compromise but involved sacrifice. Observing what can be seen obviously hurts. It is a reckoning not only with what others have not done, but also with what you have tolerated in yourself. Such a reckoning is a quiet, internal, humbling one. And it's also empowering. Because you see, once you know your own boundaries, you stop outsourcing your own happiness. You stop waiting for the other person to change so that you can change. Because you stop looking at effort as a form of hope and start looking at it as data. Because of that, silent endings won't reverse. At this stage, the relationship has already been reduced from a central relationship to a context relationship. This means the relationship is there but does not define identity or direction. The moment something no longer defines you, you can very well live without it.
it liberates you. A closure conversation wasn't required in this case, because the family had closed the emotional loop on its own. In effect, they had accepted what had happened and adjusted to it, and then moved ahead emotionally as well. All that remained were the formalities and not the emotions. Because of this, the way the ending came about was almost anti. No moment of shock, no moment of realization, no moment of rupture. Just a series of decisions consistent with self-respect rather than hope. This stage is commonly confused with coldness. It's the other way around, actually. It's warmth turned inwards. It's compassion for oneself after years of overextension. It's the realization that peace doesn't require consensus, only honesty. There was never going to be the explosion, since the explosion was unnecessary. An explosion is the act of being heard. However, everyone had already been heard, just not by one another. They listened to themselves. But once that is achieved, then the ending is no longer one of loss, but release.
Then, out of that inner stillness, the narrative ceased to be about what was wrong, but became one of what was next. Quiet endings don't quite stay fixed on blame. They turn to reconstruction, not of the relationship, but of the self. In the Browns family case, this rebuilding did not happen in one go. It came piece by piece, in choices that did not need approval, routines that did not involve emotional management. Knowing life was able to feel lighter without constant negotiation. It is the phase during which people mostly feel surprised by their capacities for self-viability. They expected to fall apart. They had expected that they would be overcome with regret. They replaced loneliness with familiarity. Instead, they found clarity. Not because the loss wasn't real, but because the loss had been grieved along the way, in small stages. Quiet endings allow grief to unfold in stages. By the time a separation becomes visible, much of the mourning has already passed. What remained was adjustment. People started noticing how much energy they now had available, how decisions felt easier, how their internal dialogue had changed from "how can I make this work?" to "what does actually work for me?" That is a subtle yet profound shift. It marks a point where obligation ceases to masquerade as love, where endurance ceases to be confused with devotion, and staying is no longer moral superiority. For the Brown family, that recognition tore apart a false narrative. Sacrifice had been cloaked as virtue, silence as strength, and compliance as unity. Letting go would require unlearning those values, and that was uncomfortable, because with the cessation of sacrifice, you must inquire about what you really want. And wanting something for yourself can feel selfish if you've been trained to put harmony above all else. This is why quiet endings often look selfish from the outside. People only see the decision to move on without drama and assume detachment. They don't see the years of compromise that preceded it. They don't see the emotional labor that finally became unsustainable. What they observe is calm, and they mistake it for indifference. But calm is often the byproduct of hard-won self-trust. By this stage, the family wasn't abandoning each other emotionally. They were simply not asking each other any longer for things they could or would not give. That's a distinction that matters, because it does reframe the ending not as rejection, but as recognition. Recognition that relationships don't fail because people are not caring enough. They fail because their care isn't supported by the structure, equity, and accountability of the people around them. Once that fact is acknowledged, then the urge for confrontation lessens. There's nothing left to debate, nothing to clear up in terms of misunderstandings, no apology which could alter the outcome, no promise to restore the balance. The resolution works because its base is in comprehension, not emotion. This is the stage where people stop explaining their decisions, not out of secrecy, but because explanation implies debate, and there is no debate left to have. The family was moving forward quietly, each with their own way, with various renditions of the same truth, the truth being that staying had become incompatible with peace. Where the priority is peace, the end doesn't need loudness, it only needs resolve. By now, the ending had finally settled into place, not as an event, but as a new normal. What felt once like a rupture felt now like distance that had always been there, finally acknowledged. The emotional noise of daily life had faded, pushed out by something quieter and steadier. It is here that people often realize how much energy they were expelling to keep something afloat. Without that constant effort, life doesn't suddenly become perfect, but it gets more honest. There's less second-guessing, fewer emotional negotiations, fewer moments spent wondering whether your needs are reasonable or your expectations too high. The Brown family reached this realization separately, yet the effect was collective. The system no longer demanded constant maintenance, and without that demand, it simply loosened. No confrontation was needed, for there was nothing left holding it tightly together.
What's striking about quiet endings, maybe most of all, is how little they need in terms of explanation. There doesn't need to be a shared story anymore. It doesn't need there to be agreement. Everyone just holds their own understanding, and that can be enough. This is also the point where nostalgia can creep in. Nostalgia not for how things were, but how they should have been. The dream that once gave sense to it all, to all the compromise. The future that was always promised and never came. This, at times, may feel heavier to let go of than the relationship itself, but even that weight lightens over time. But what happens when you stop building your life around an unmet expectation? You get your agency back. You notice opportunities were always available but seemed unreachable to you. You realize that peace doesn't come from fixing what's broken. It comes from no longer living inside the break. What went wrong was moot. The family didn't need to agree on that to move on. They only needed to agree inwardly that what was couldn't be sustained. And once sustainability became the metric, quiet endings make a lot of sense. There was no explosion, for explosions are attempts to force change. But by this stage, no one was trying to force anything anymore. Change had already happened, inwardly. What remained was alignment. Alignment of values and actions, needs and boundaries, truth and behavior. It's an alignment that doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't claim validation. It simply is. And when it does, the resolution stops feeling like something that happened to you and starts feeling like something you chose.
And so at this point, the only thing left was acceptance. Not the kind that floated on the surface, but the kind that changed the way one moved in the world. Acceptance that didn't diminish the pain, but cleared away the confusion. Acceptance that didn't excuse the past, but let go of the urge to return there. This is where quiet endings become permanent. People stop reflecting on past conversations in their heads. They stop wondering what they might have said differently. They stop thinking about moments and trying to remember exactly when they had gone wrong. Not because those moments hadn't mattered, but because comprehension had taken its place. Understanding alters the emotional equation. When you know that it couldn't have worked that way you wanted it to, the regret no longer has a hold on you. You are freed from blame for attempting what only two people could accomplish. In the Brown family, this stage represented movement forward. There was no need to replace the losses that had been suffered. There was no need to redefine the ending. Essentially, people were moving at their own pace and were being guided by the same inner beacon, respect for the self. Such is the subtle power of explosive-less conclusions. They don't ask for closure from anyone else. They don't need permission. They don't require the other person to agree, to even understand. They are whole by themselves. It's around this point that people realize how much emotional strength they have reclaimed. A strength that was once pouring out to brace, to prepare for, to survive the struggle, will begin to flow out to heal, to find repose, to explore again. The family, however, did not come away unscathed. Quiet endings still hurt, but the pain was cleaner, less chaotic, less all-consuming. It did not keep repeating itself with every disappointment. What surprised many of them was how little anger was left. Anger dissipates when you're no longer needing it to shield you, when the boundary is held from within, instead of from a place of conflict. At this point, the ending no longer felt like something to explain. I think it just felt true. And truth, once believed, does not need to be proven. By the time everything was settled, it all made sense, that there was no explosion. Nothing had been repressed. Nothing had been left unexpressed within those who mattered most. The ending wasn't arrived through a confrontation, since it wasn't necessary anymore. Everyone already knew. Anxious conclusions are not the result of confusion. Anxious conclusions are a product of clarity. Clarity that no amount of talking will shift the architecture. Clarity that there will be no harmony to the amount of work put out. Clarity that to remain is to continue to negotiate against your own prosperity. Such assurance is a heavy burden, though it is also a steadying one. In the Brown family, what finally ended wasn't a relationship. It was a belief system. The belief that endurance equals virtue, that silence equals maturity, that loyalty requires self-erasure. Letting go meant rejecting those ideas, even if no one ever said that out loud. And that's why the finale didn't require any drama. Drama. This stuff happens when people still think they can salvage something.
when they're trying to be recognized, held accountable, or changed. But when they cease to be recognized in terms of someone's limits, then all noise ceases. What replaces it is resolve. Everyone brought their own idea of an ending. Not the same story, no shared culpability, but a shared sense that the system was no longer in sync with who they were growing to be. And it is alignment, not agreement, that is paramount. There was grief, yes, but it was honest grief, not the kind that was ignited by unanswered questions. There was sadness, but it wasn't messy. It didn't occupy every nook and corner of their minds. It passed through them instead. That's the difference. The explosive endings involve the burning of everything at the same time. Quite often, quiet endings involve the release of things in a slow. They enable a person to leave with dignity intact, with a sense of self-trust intact, with a future not dependent upon another's growth. In the end, nothing ended in an instant. What had been lost had already lost its base. There had been no emptiness in the calm that ensued. There had only been space. Space to breathe. Space to rebuild. Space to live without constant negotiation. La historia no acabó con estrindom porque no necesitaba hacerlo. It concluded when the pretenses ended. Then once the pretending ends, the end doesn't have to come with an explosion. The only thing it needs is the truth.